We shall see in the chapter God departs another devotee seeking entire refuge in them and being cured of a mysterious illness that endangered her life. I must admit frankly that I was stunned by the mother's boldness and could not have an unreserved faith. Either in this context or another, I had asked the mother and Sri Aurobindo if they had cured cancer by their force. The mother replied firmly, not only cancer, other diseases too, pronounced incurable by the doctors. Isn't it so? She asked Sri Aurobindo, as if looking for confirmation. He nodded. The mother once said that there is hardly a disease that yoga cannot cure. Sri Aurobindo also wrote, of course yoga, can, but on condition of faith or openness or both. Even a mental suggestion can cure cancer, with luck of course, as is shown by the case of the woman operated on unsuccessfully for cancer, but the doctors lied and told her it had succeeded. Result, cancer symptoms all ceased and she died many years afterwards of another illness altogether. Here was a patient, then, who came with faith in the mother. I began to do my duty regularly. At first the patient came for Pranam to the mother. I witnessed her intense concentration and preoccupation with the case. While listening to the report, she would suddenly go into a trance and Sri Aurobindo would intently watch over her. Once she was on the point of falling down. Sri Aurobindo stretched both his arms, exclaiming, "Ah!" The mother regained her control. Things seemed to be moving at a slow pace. If some symptoms improved, new ones appeared, the condition fluctuated from day to day. Some days passed in a comparative restfulness. Our help was mostly psychological, to give courage and instill faith. If some progress was noticed, I would with a cheerful face report it to the mother. She would just listen quietly. Meanwhile, letters from the relatives urged the patient to return. When the mother heard about it, she replied, "If I can't cure it, there is none who can." The fight continued. It was a grim encounter, indeed. As a result of the mother's steady force, things looked bright and I felt we had turned the corner. The mother kept her vigil and wasted no words. After the February darshan, however, the picture changed for no apparent reason. The patient went gradually downhill and in a month or two, life petered out. The patient was brought before the mother to have her last blessings. She came down and with her soothing touch and the balm of her divine smile wiped away all his distress and made his passage peaceful. Later when I asked Sri Aurobindo the reason for this unaccountable reversal, he replied, after the darshan his faith got shaken and he could not get it back. Cancer of the throat is a scourge, one cannot eat, drink or speak, breathing becomes difficult. Let us remember Sri Ramakrishna's classical example. To keep a steady faith needs a heroic will which how many can have? Besides, the family surroundings also were not very congenial. I remember Nishikanto, a Sardak poet, who fell seriously ill after being cured of an equally serious illness. The mother giving the occult reason told me that when he came to her on his birthday, she saw a definite crack in his faith. But a man of quite a different temperament, he pulled himself up, while the cancer patient could not. Why take up such a case at all? One may ask. Well, it was the patient who made the choice. He had no faith in the usual medico-surgical treatment whose efficacy is at best doubtful. Here, he had at least the unique opportunity to live under the mother's and Sri Aurobindo's direct care and supervision. For a bhakta, there cannot be a greater boon. If he lives, it will be glorious. If he dies, he will have a better life in the next birth. Some years ago the mother said in connection with another cancer case that was referred to her from outside, that cancer has been conquered in the subtle world and the conquest will soon materialize here. Another complicated illness I was confronted with during this period was that of a Sardak. A typical Englishman, stiff but polite, a cultured, sensitive poet, the poor man had never enjoyed good health since his childhood and in later years was also mentally shaken. I had been treating him for chronic liver trouble, indigestion, etc., for some years before he had this illness. Either because of this, or by nature, he was none too optimistic. Besides, he had suffered from rheumatism and infantile paralysis too. The mother and Sri Aurobindo knew his temperament very well and instructed me to look after him with a large consideration, as they themselves had always done. He was turned into a fine poet by Sri Aurobindo's force. I wonder how with such a poor health he managed to do yoga. That, however, is none of my business. Failing to diagnose his illness, I called in other doctors, and as is often the case, opinions differed. Neither were there proper facilities for making specific tests in the hospital. He began to suffer from fever, jaundice, abscesses, joint pains, and a host of diverse complaints which made him extremely irritable. He pestered me like Socrates with all sorts of questions, the why and the how of his ailments, their remedy, and the last question, when would he be all right? I reported faithfully all this to the mother and to Sri Aurobindo, who would often side with him, appreciating his inquisitiveness and his refusal to gulp down docilely all that was given to him. When I told Sri Aurobindo that he would not allow his old dusty heaps of the journal, Manchester Guardian, to be removed, Sri Aurobindo approved of his feelings. One day the mother said, "Once when you were fanning Sri Aurobindo, I had a vision of the patient crying to you, 'Why don't you cure me?' On the other hand, Sri Aurobindo had told me that the patient was disgusted with his ailing body and would like to leave it. We are made of many conflicting parts." My inner comment was, the mother's occult sight could read all our movements. Only if she could always prescribe remedies. To that question Sri Aurobindo gave, in our correspondence, a rather evasive answer. He said, "Why do you want us to do your work?" Of course, I understood what he meant. There is a humorous episode connected with this patient's ailment, which will be interesting to note here. The mother had advised me in my medical practice to develop the power of intuition. One of the methods I followed was to go into meditation and see, hear or feel something relating to a particular case. Now, in the present quandary, I tried the method. After a couple of failures, what I saw in the meditation was a brinjal. When I blurted it out to Sri Aurobindo and to my colleagues, they all roared with laughter. Thenceforth they would taunt me with Nirod's brinjal intuition. To end the sad story, the case was not showing any improvement. One after another complications began to develop. Above all, his outer consciousness failed to respond actively to the force. The mother saw that the only way that could save the patient was to send him to Bangalore, where he could be treated by an efficient German doctor well known to us. Sri Aurobindo asked me to prepare a clear and complete history of the patient's malady, let the mother hear it and then send it to the doctor. When it was ready, I read it out to both of them. Sri Aurobindo commented, "Excellent." I felt gratified. On receiving the report, the doctor came down to take the patient. He concurred with our view that it must be a case of septicemia. When the patient was being sent off, the mother came and stood on her terrace waiting a long time for him. At last the car came before her and she and the patient looked at each other for quite a while. He had a premonition that he would not come back. We felt very sad, indeed, but there was no other choice. Next day, a telegram arrived carrying the news that the patient had suddenly collapsed and died in the train. As soon as I heard it, my head began to reel and I had to sit down before Sri Aurobindo. It was a most treacherous blow. The post-mortem revealed that there was an inflammation of the heart's envelope with a little collection of fluid behind the heart, and yet clinically there was no sign of it. Now to finish the medical story with one or two positive examples. A striking case of cure by the yogic force was that of Champaklal S. He had corneal ulcer and iritis. I took him to the local eye specialist who advised him complete rest. He was obliged to stop his service of the master, a blow much more painful to him than the illness. Awfully dejected, He passed his days in an inert resignation in bed, showing no sign of improvement. The mother and Sri Aurobindo would listen quietly to my report till one day the mother paid him a visit. On her return, she told Sri Aurobindo, "The case is serious. He must not remain in bed one moment longer. He should resume work." I was speechless. I could not make out on what ground she made that observation. Subjective or objective? I knew, of course, from my previous medical experience that she sees beyond our sight. The bandage was removed and he rejoined work. Curiously enough, he became all right in 2 or 3 days without any treatment whatsoever. Apart from the divine force, the psychological factor, the sense of active physical nearness to Sri Aurobindo, must have counted a lot. It will not be out of place to mention a minor instance of yogic cure in my own case. While in actual attendance on Sri Aurobindo, I was gripped by a sudden violent colic pain. I had to leave the work and lie down. Sri Aurobindo was informed about it. I was simply tossing on the floor when suddenly I heard a voice within me, "Keep absolutely quiet." Straining all my will, I lay stiff on my back in a board-like rigidity. Imperceptibly sleep came, as if I had been given a morphia injection, and I woke up in a normal state. We have seen cases in which the lack of proper psychological conditions prevented the effective intervention by the divine force. Now I shall cite a serious case where Sri Aurobindo himself declared the divine intervention had its full effect. The patient, a thin, wiry man of about 40, used to suffer from aciditas and came to me for treatment. But being extremely greedy, he could never observe the essential part of the cure, the diet. In 1934, before I had taken up the dispensary work, he invited me for a cup of tea. I asked the mother's permission, for at that time we were supposed to obtain her approval for any external movement not concerned with sadhana, and Sri Aurobindo replied, "It would be better not to take SS things. This cooking has reawakened his greed of food and made him ill again after I had completely cured him." Then a year later, I believe it was in 1935, he came to me for treatment for the first time. I wrote to Sri Aurobindo in my medical report, "SS story is out." In addition to green mangoes, he had some rasagalas too. This food business is almost a possession with him. Sri Aurobindo wrote back, "So I heard." Why almost? We have decided to remove his stove for good. Rather childish, but what else can be done? I continued, and he replied, "Quite right." The doctor said that he was surprised by the relapses of SS health until he found that when he was not there, S used to get up and secretly cook food for himself on the stove. Palate satisfaction seems to be more precious to him than his life. After about 5 months I received a note from Sri Aurobindo, "Is the condition of S dangerous or critical? If it is so, or if it becomes so, it will be better to send for a French doctor who will take the responsibility of the case." The mother was knocked up in the small hours and informed that S was very bad and hiccuping. I presume the French doctor has been sent for by this time. If it is serious, let us have news 2 or 3 times a day. I replied to him, "SS condition is neither dangerous nor critical. It is a case of hyperacidity. He has vomited a lot and has found some relief now. But I hear that he wants to be treated by our renowned homeopath. I have no objection, subject to your approval." And this is what Sri Aurobindo wrote to me: "I expect you to put your medical feelings under a glass case in a corner for the time and help the homeopath so far as nursing and other care for S goes." I handed over the patient to R and did the nursing part as asked by Sri Aurobindo. He also wanted me to send him a regular report of the case. The patient started copious vomiting of blood and passing blood in the stool. When I asked the Guru how far the exact reporting was essential for the action of the force, he replied, "It is absolutely essential. Wrong information or concealment of important facts may have disastrous consequences." I reported, "His condition will be critical at night. Two things must be done: hiccup has to stop, and he must have sleep. He is extremely weak. Are you sure about him? His answer came, no. From the beginning of the case I have not been at all sure of it. The circumstances have been very contrary and there has not been the usual response to the force which makes recovery only a matter of time. It seems to me that it is an old illness which has suddenly taken an acute and perilous form. If tomorrow morning there is no improvement, we can call for Layer 1, I hope it will be in time. The next day, there was a sudden good turn, putting the patient beyond the danger zone. Synchronous with the mother's coming down to give general blessings, he went into a sound sleep with the temporary cessation of the hiccup. It was at this time that I felt that he had crossed the danger line. Sri Aurobindo, confirming my feelings, wrote, "There was something, a sense of a danger past and a force put out. There is a change in so far as SS physical has begun to respond, while before it was not responsive at all. There is no longer the predominance of the dark forces that there was before. But the response has to increase before one can be absolutely sure of the result. The obstinacy of the hiccup is a dark point that ought to disappear." After a long and strenuous vigil, the mother's and Sri Aurobindo's unflagging concentration, daily reports of the progress, the homeopath's blunders and effective medicines, the patient recovered. I did not know really to whom the credit went, to the force or the homeopath. There was a supposition also that the patient's complete surrender to the mother had made this miracle possible. I had given up all hope of recovery when I saw him vomiting such a lot of blood. Surgical intervention was out of the question, for the local hospital surgeon was not very competent. Sri Aurobindo suggested it by way of keeping ourselves on the safe side of the law, since we had no legal authority to practice. Neither had I much faith in the homeopath when the case was handed over to him, though he had made a big name in the town. One thing I must say in favor of the patient, that he never lost hope and was throughout conscious. If I was in an anxiety he would give me hope, saying, "Doctor, don't think that I am going to die." Sri Aurobindo wrote to me, "The man has a belief in yoga force and that helps." In this predicament I wanted a straight answer from Sri Aurobindo as to which factor played the dominant part in the cure, the force or the doctor. I was doubtful about the latter because he had committed many blunders which were recognized by Sri Aurobindo and they had to be counteracted by the force. The illuminating answer I received from him is as follows: "It was only when the heart began to misbehave seriously, that, as often happens, in response to the danger a big force began to come down and SS body also responded. It was that response that saved him, not any surrender." I think the force can take more credit than RS medicines, although the latter were very useful, one might say an indispensable assistance. Yet it was whenever a big force came in that S made a bound forward, and each time on the lines indicated by the force: first the heart's recovery, next the deliverance of the liver, third the overcoming of the hyperacid excesses. I was an obstacle as well as a help. Twice. First, in his confounded decision to encourage yellow fever, the bile had to be cleared out of course, but not in that dangerous way. Next, in his lime juice excesses, the orange juice was useful, but frantically overdone. As soon as he dropped his first mistake, the bile set itself right. As soon as he dropped his second to some extent and administered orange juice plus medicine reasonably, the rest ameliorated. If so, it was because the force got a chance to work straight, helped and not impeded. This then is one case among many others which I have followed step by step, and have Sri Aurobindo's own words to vouch for the cure of the case by his force. To say a few words about the success of a case by the divine force or its failure, Sri Aurobindo has never maintained that the force is infallible. Only the supramental force is a dead cert. But it is extremely difficult to bring it down. Short of that, everything is a play of possibility where many factors count: the doctor, the patient, the environment. The force is not a magician, as we understand the word. It takes into account all these factors, particularly the faith and openness of the patient, as in this case. If the patient's soul wants to leave the body, the force cannot compel it to remain. In short, it is a complex tangle of forces that has to be dealt with, each case different from another, and there is no universal rule that can be applied to all. Nevertheless, if 2 cases have failed, we have seen other serious ones where the cause of success was beyond all doubt. There were 2 small occasions when I attended on the mother. Usually, she was not in the habit of consulting doctors. Her doctor was Sri Aurobindo. But once when her hand had swollen for no apparent reason, Sri Aurobindo asked me to have a look at it. I examined it in his presence with a certain amount of shy hesitation. Here lay the difference between myself and Dr. Manilal. He would have done the job in quite a businesslike manner. The case was simple, however, and got cured with hot fomentation. The next occasion was when she was having much pain in the ear, perhaps from an insect bite. Sri Aurobindo asked if I could do something. I examined the ear and found a tiny spot of hemorrhage inside. The mother inquired if the insect was still there. I said no, but when I suggested some ear drops for the pain, she replied, "No, no medicine for me." Medicines were an anathema to both the mother and Sri Aurobindo. Throughout their long yogic life they cured all their own ailments by applying the force. Medicines were accepted only during the later stage of Sri Aurobindo's last illness and in the recent illness of the mother. There were special reasons for this. I have given some of them in Sri Aurobindo's case in the chapter God Departs. Sri Aurobindo wrote to me about the action of medicine on the mother's body. Medicines have quite a different action on the mother's body than they would have on yours or excess or anybody else's, and the reaction is not usually favorable. Her physical consciousness is not the same as that of ordinary people, though even in ordinary people it is not so identical in all cases as science would have us believe. Now I shall pass on to another field of the mother's activity which can be called yogic, though it would not be quite the right term to use. For, according to the mother, there is no yogic or unyogic activity, all life is yoga. This does not mean, as is frequently misinterpreted, that everything can pass as yogic. It refers to the fact that the whole of nature's evolution is secretly a slow and gradual preparation for the spiritual life. Thus every earthly activity has a divine purpose behind it. So the mother and Sri Aurobindo accept the whole field of nature as the field of yoga, but they aim at transforming life as common movement, rejecting the ignorant turn it mostly takes and bringing out the divine truth which is secret within it. To achieve this, they want us always to be in the spiritual consciousness so that whatever life activity is accepted becomes a part of yoga and undergoes transformation. I have said that Sri Aurobindo's accident had upset all her previous program. Pranam, interviews and meditation had to be given up or suspended for a time. It was almost a break with the past. And with the arrival of the children and their parents, our way of life also had to undergo a considerable change. The old things came back, but in a new form. No more 7 or 8 hour darshans, 2 or 3 hour pranams, evening meditations, etc. Now, for instance, for pranam, the mother used to come and stand at the top of the main staircase at about 10:00 a.m. And a whole crowd would go up to her, the ceremony lasting for nearly 2 or 3 hours, the mother remaining on her feet all the time. From Sri Aurobindo's room we used to hear people holding long talks with her on personal or departmental matters. The mother would be quite oblivious of time and space or of persons. She would go on hearing the various complaints, reports and sometimes discussing some points, no matter for how long, while the queue behind would wait and wait jammed on the narrow and packed staircase. This was, as I have pointed out, her method of working, one-pointed concentration. The business in hand must be first attended to. We have seen this characteristic of hers in many instances. During Christmas, it was her custom to send baskets to the European and American inmates, out of consideration for their national sentiments, I suppose. On its eve she would sit down in a chair or on a low stool and with the help of some sadhakas arrange each basket, consider each individual's taste, necessity, fancy, giving cheese, chocolate, fruits, etc., etc. While time would stop flowing for her. We were waiting in Sri Aurobindo's ashram for his meal, but we knew and would joke with one another that the mother was in her element, for though divine, her human motherly instinct could not be forgotten. After the pranam was over, actually there was no pranam, for people would receive only a flower and could talk to her of their need. Then at about 1:00 p.m. she would hold a class in the Darshan hall, in the form of questions and answers, somewhat on the lines of Sri Aurobindo's talks with us, very probably inspired by them. But only those who knew French were allowed to attend it, questions and answers being conducted in French. Again exceptions were made afterwards. Some people who did not know French attended and asked questions in English. I too was very keen on attending it, partly because we had no work at that time. It was Sri Aurobindo's silent period, to be broken only when the mother brought his food after the talks. I managed to write a few lines in French asking her permission. She read the note before Sri Aurobindo and said smiling, "He wants to show his knowledge of French." However, the class began, if I remember rightly, with the reading of the prayers and meditations, and questions were asked in relation to the text. Only questions on spiritual matters were allowed, but when they gradually grew fewer in number, it was made an open class, I believe. There were not many at that time who knew French very well. And the mother talked so fast that I wonder how many could follow her. Here is one difference between Sri Aurobindo and the mother. The mother, being by her very nature Shakti, the divine energy, could not be slow and leisurely in manner, action or speech like the Purusha, though as I have shown, she could be extraordinarily patient and continue a work for a long stretch of time. It was a new experience indeed, for till then our approach to her was individual and restricted mostly to practical guidance. There was no intellectual communication, and the mother would always discourage intellectual questions. This was the first time she became collectively expansive and was ready to respond to intellectual seekings, but mainly on spiritual matters. These talks naturally reminded me of Sri Aurobindo's talks for their vivid contrast, and I could not but make a mental comparison between them. They sharply bring out the characteristics of two different personalities, though their consciousness is one. Here the mother's personality dominated the whole atmosphere. Her tone, mood and manner were stamped with a seriousness, energy and force that demanded close attention. Humor did not play a conspicuous role, but there were flashes of wit. Her eyes were on everybody. Her answers, though meant for the questioner, were directed towards all, so that there was no room for being inattentive or indifferent. When a play by the mother was staged by our students, she strictly enjoined on the young children to keep complete silence. The striking difference with Sri Aurobindo, as I have pointed out, was his impersonality. He asked questions or answered them without looking at the questioner. He spoke slowly in a subdued voice with no stress in it. There was no constraint upon you. You were having a talk with a friend, and in friendship, levity, gravity, all were in order. Still, Sri Aurobindo remained Sri Aurobindo to us. There was no loss of reverence. Some of us had hotly discussed topics even to the point of losing our temper before his witness Purusha consciousness. That would be very unusual before the mother. To put a homely simile, they were like a father and mother, both loving but one indulgent, liberal, large, the other a firm though not inconsiderate disciplinarian. Both are aspects of the one divine, impersonal and personal, Purusha and Prakriti, and both have their ineffable charm. Though all were free to ask her questions, it was not always easy to ask them, as the answers, instead of having a direct bearing on the questions, were sometimes directed against the consciousness of the person involved, for to her, it was that which was more important, and our consciousness was an open book to her inner sight. These talks continued for quite a long time. The hall used to be packed. Unfortunately, no regular record has been kept, first because they flowed very fast, and secondly, there were only a few who understood French well. In later days, some talks were held in English out of a special consideration for a few people. I shall quote one or two of them from my scanty records.q. What is the origin of anger and how to get rid of it? A. Is there anybody here who is angry? Laughter, apart from its origin, when you are angry, it means you have lost control of yourself. As to getting rid of it, you must have a strong will to do so. Laughter. No, I don't say it as a joke, though it may seem like one. It is because people don't take a firm decision, use strongly their will, that things do not become effective. There are contradictory parts in the being, one part may decide, while others pit themselves against the decision, they lie hidden behind. As soon as one part has said, I won't get angry again, they say, my friend, just wait, let the occasion come. And when it comes, the man forgets his decision and throws himself into anger. But if you really know how to take the decision, then nothing can undo it. I will give you an instance. My brother, older than I by about 18 months, was extremely excitable in his boyhood. I was an expert in knowing how to make him angry. Both of us were fond of each other, but when he was angry he lost all control of himself. One day we were playing croquet, either because he got beaten or for some other reason. He flew into a rage and struck me hard with the mallet. Fortunately I escaped with a slight injury. Next time when we were sitting in a room, he threw a big chair headlong towards me. I bent down just in time and the chair passed over my head. Lastly, as we were coming down from a carriage, he pushed me down under it. Luckily the horse did not move. Then my mother told him, one day you will kill your own sister. That suddenly brought him to his senses and made him realize the consequence of his own folly. On that very day he took a firm decision not to be angry ever in life again, and he never was. He has performed high government duties and people have told me they have not seen him angry even once. Question: why is it necessary to have the experience again and argue in? A. What I have meant is that one must not repeat dogmas and creeds without having himself realized them first. People have a very common habit of saying, for example, God is everywhere, everything is good since God exists in everything. You have no right to say such things before you have realized them. For then they lose all force and become nothing but a dogma. If you simply repeat what others have said and experienced, it can have no benefit for others. You must yourself go through it, see it from different aspects and live it, find something new in it. Then only it becomes interesting and effective. We owe, by the way, a debt of gratitude to the mother's brother, for it was his indirect intervention in the colonial office of the French government at Paris that went a long way towards removing a very great threat to the ashram's existence, brought about by the manipulation of the British India government. I come now to the last of her day's activities that I have witnessed as well as heard about from others. It was one of the strangest I could think of and could be taken up by her alone, for her inspiration comes from, to quote Nishikanto's phrase, a God-white source riot from human reason. I mean her evening meditation and pranam. I have already made a reference to them. The meditation started in a very reasonable manner at about 8:00 p.m. She would go down and, standing in the middle of the lower part of the staircase, give a silent meditation to all sitting below for about half an hour, then as he would come up, look in on Sri Aurobindo, and come back after a while with his supper. Once she said to him, after a long time, the gods have come to the meditation. This recalls Sri Aurobindo's verses. Calm faces of the gods on backgrounds vast, bringing the marvel of the infinitude. As usual, the time began to shift gradually till it reached 11 p.m., then 12, then 1, and meditation was substituted by pranam. What an unearthly hour for pranam! This happened particularly when she was passing through a period of trance. Many people would go to sleep in the courtyard, especially young boys and girls. Then Haradan, an old Sardak, would announce, "Mother has come, Mother has come." All would wake up and in a flurry stand in the queue to see the mother, who was often in a state of trance. Her eyes closed, head bent, flower in hand. Suddenly the trance would break and a few would pass in quick succession, again a lapse into trance. We would watch from our terrace above, while Sri Aurobindo was taking rest, the queue moving on and suddenly a halt for a long time, then moving fast, again a halt. The mother used to look like a veritable goddess, superb in all her majesty and glory, in the deep hush of the midnight. Some would sit in front of her and meditate, or feast their eyes on that marvelous scene. At this time a nephew of mine was staying with me. He was of a very independent nature. He used to come home late at night, get up late, was very untidy in his habits due probably to his artistic temperament. I tried to mend his ways but failed. I complained to the mother, her answer baffled me. She said, "Why, he comes to me." I did not see how it answered the problem, which continued all the same, with the result that one day I gave him a very mild slap, and reported the fact to the mother. She said, "That is why he doesn't listen to you." The reply surprised me, as she put the cause as the effect. I could not, however, argue with her. Then looking steadily into my eyes, she said, "Look here. I will tell you a story. You know I had a brother. Both of us were very fond of each other. He used to come home late, for which my father would beat him. One day I told my father, 'Beat him once more and I will leave the house immediately.' That stern threat stopped his beating. I was very young then. Since then, I left the boy to his own fate." Even today the mother holds this attitude and has standing instructions that guardians, teachers, captains must not inflict punishment of any kind on children. There are several other major activities the mother started during this time and even participated in. A few of them have taken a premier place in our life and gained worldwide recognition. Though I did not hear the mother talking about them to Sri Aurobindo as much as the foregoing activities, I saw them growing up under her aegis slowly, and by her power. I might just as well give a short description of some of them by way of illustration of her multitudinous activities, her intensity, drive, boldness and creative genius. We shall see how some institutions have developed from a nascent stage into banyan trees spreading their branches far and wide, and are inspiring countries with a new vision. The two major activities that she took up during this period were the Ashram School and Physical Education, which together form the Sri Aurobindo International Center of Education. Both of them, like the others, were born from tiny chromosomes and out of a compelling necessity, for the Japanese aggression had driven the children of the disciples in affected areas to seek shelter in the protecting arms of the mother. She had now to devote much of her crowded time to the children who needed a special treatment, since they had not come for yoga. It was a challenging problem suddenly thrown upon her by nature. Our ashram life also took a different turn. The old barriers completely broke down under this influx. No longer a hermitage of peace, silence and inner expansion and acquisition, it had to be tested in the crucible of outer life. We soon became one spiritual family. The mother had to look after the mental, vital, and physical health of the green ones, both boys and girls. Along with the necessity, means also came forward to meet the demand. Sisir Kumar Mitra from Vishwabharati, with a long teaching experience, and Pranab Kumar Bhattacharya from Calcutta, an expert in physical culture, came and were given charge of the two wings of education, mental and physical. Particularly in young Pranab, the mother found an excellent instrument for physical culture, and with his help she quickly built up the center of physical education. I don't need to discuss the place and raison d'etre of physical education in our ashram life when Sri Aurobindo has done it so well in his essay on the divine body. 1 My vision being more earthly, I can see that it has served the most important purpose of keeping the inflammable material of young boys, girls and children under strict supervision through compulsory activities from 4:30 p.m. to 7:00 p.m. or so. One can very well imagine what would have been the moral effect on them, had there not been this central control, especially when the children here are given a great freedom of movement. Those young people who have cut themselves off from these collective activities suffer much from psychological troubles. Most of the ills of the youth outside have their origin in having no occupation after college and school hours. After Sri Aurobindo's passing, the mother gave me one sound counsel: be in the atmosphere, by which she meant that I should not isolate myself from the collective activities. When there was a demand for more holidays, the mother remarked, "I have started the school so that the children may not knock about in the streets." Since then, Kumar has resisted the pressure of the students for more holidays. The mother now began to identify herself more and more with this new generation. In the evening when Sri Aurobindo was enjoying his solitude, the mother, after her tennis, busied herself in the playground meeting the children, watching their games and exercises, taking classes, etc., and through all these means, establishing an intimate contact with them. The exercises were done in cumbersome pajamas, which consequently checked free movement. One evening when I went to visit the playground, I found the gate closed. The gatekeeper told me that the mother did not want anyone except the group members to enter the playground. When it was thrown open, we found, to our surprise, that the girls were doing exercises in shorts. How did this revolutionary change come about? Here, in brief, is the story from one who played an active part in it. One day, one of the girls, doing her exercises in pajamas in the playground, fell down and got hurt owing to the impractical dress. When the mother was told about it, she listened quietly. After a couple of days, she called Bratati, one of the sadhakas of her intimate circle. She had such small intimate groups of young boys, girls and adults, and said, "I have solved the problem of the uniform. The girls will put on white shorts, a white shirt and a kitta cap on the head for their hair. Prepare them and try them on yourself. Pajamas are unwieldy. When you are ready, let me know about it." When everything was ready, she informed the mother and a day was fixed for the rehearsal in strict privacy. The mother was pleased with the design. Calling the girls together, she gave a short impressive talk on the new experiment and the necessity for trying it. They at once fell in with the proposal and adopted the new uniform. But what was the reaction to this drastic step? Some, particularly old people, were shocked to see their daughters scantily dressed and doing exercises jointly with boys. A few conservative guardians were planning to take their wards away from such a modernized ashram. I, personally, admired, on the one hand, the revolutionary step taken by the mother far in advance of the time in Eastern countries, in anticipation of the modern movement in dress. On the other hand, my cautious mind, or as Sri Aurobindo would say, my coward mind, could not but feel the risk involved in this forward venture. At the same time I knew that the mother's very nature is to face danger, if necessary. And whenever we had tried to argue with her that we were doing things which were not done outside, she replied sharply, "Why should we follow the others? They have no ideas, we have ideas. I have come to break down old conventions and superstitions." Besides, whatever measures she adopts are not done for the sake of novelty or from mental reasons. Mother is guided by her intuition, Sri Aurobindo reminded us very often. Also, I believe, she prepares the ground in the occult planes and manipulates the forces to her advantage before she takes any hazardous step. That is why we hear her say, "Wait, wait." For the opportune moment, I suppose. We can realize now the wisdom of her vision in taking that revolutionary step. Further, I think it was one of the most effective means to eliminate sex consciousness between the male and the female. We are in this respect much better than before now that shorts have become almost our normal dress. To cut short the story, thanks to her long and sustained labor, these two institutions have gained today their well-deserved recognition abroad, particularly the physical culture. On the occasion of the April Darshan in 1949, the members of this organization called JSASA1 were given the privilege of a march past in their group uniforms before the master and the mother. Sri Aurobindo seemed to have been much impressed by the smartness of the young boys' group. The mother became so preoccupied with the various activities in the playground that she would return at about 8 or 9 p.m. with a garland around her neck, put by Pranam, and she would offer it at Sri Aurobindo's feet. Her intensive concentration at the playground made people remark that the supermind would descend there first. When Sri Aurobindo was told about it, he commented, "I won't get the supermind, then." It is of interest to note that the supramental manifestation did take place during a meditation in the playground on February 29, 1956. I shall now take up a minor but important activity of which the world has not heard much. I mean the mother's coaching in dramatics. After her return from tennis and finishing all other activities, she would attend the dramatic rehearsals of our children who were being trained for the school anniversary on the 1st of December. She herself would select the play or theme, choose the roles for different participants and coach them individually night after night till they were ready. I have been told what minute care she took to correct the movements, articulations of each actor, and how she would not spare anyone. A young participant told me laughingly that once he ran away for fear of being scolded before the others. Sometimes the mother would give descriptions of the display to Sri Aurobindo. Once when a suitable theme was hard to find, for Sri Aurobindo's dramas had not yet come out, I suggested to the mother in the presence of Sri Aurobindo, to stage Savitri. She accepted the idea. Thanks to her assiduous personal training and attention, our novices learnt the art of acting with beauty and refinement. Though she herself cannot attend these functions nowadays, the tradition she established is respectfully maintained by the artistes she prepared. A foreign visitor seeing the mother in her colorful tennis dress observed that she looked like Sarah Bernhardt, the famous French actress. Curiously enough, I had the same impression when I first saw her in that costume without knowing much of the actress except her great name. The mother's dramatic faculty and wonderful gift of elocution gave substance to my impression. The picture that now emerges of the mother's daily life is one of intense dynamism expressing itself in various ways: creative, organizational, artistic, physical, etc., etc., leaving out of account numberless small individual touches interspersed between the big activities. Except for a few hours for meals and bath and some rest at night, the wheel went round and round with hardly a stop. Even in the midst of such whirling activity she found time for teaching arithmetic to a boy and reading prayers and meditations in French, at midnight to some youngsters. Once a young boy was found in the streets at about 2 a.m. The French officer who was on patrol challenged him. When he saw that the boy had a flower in his hand, he asked, "This flower is from the mother?" "Yes," he replied, "I am coming from the mother." "So late at night?" exclaimed the officer, utterly baffled, and let him go. The officer knew the mother. I have seen her bestowing special attention on some young people and sending them to bed past midnight. Mysterious are her ways. I shall cite an instance of her eye for minor details. A Sothikor recounted to me how the mother remembers even the smallest details in the midst of her most busy hours. Once during the Pranam and sari distribution, when all the inmates, numbering about 500, passed in a line before the mother and a sardak standing by her side handed the saris to her one by one, the mother gave the Sothikor a sari with a black border. Next day when she came up to see the mother on some business, she said, "I don't know why X handed that black-bordered sari for you. There is a heap over there, go and choose whichever you like." The Sothikor replied, "It doesn't matter, mother. Give me whichever you like." The mother gave her a green-bordered one. She was simply staggered at her extraordinary observation and recollection of even an apparently insignificant detail in the midst of a crowded program and was quite overwhelmed by the unexpected touch of her divine grace. And this is not the only instance. In those old days when our number was limited and the mother could establish a personal contact with all of us, big or small, we all had such unexpected touches to treasure in our memory. This faculty, whatever else it might be, is certainly not human, it is a power beyond and above the human that is all the time at work. Here is another small instance, gathered from the private diary of a young Sadhaka, to show how the mother in the midst of her crammed activities found time to push individuals or groups on the path of their soul's aspiration. She used to see 10 or 12 young girls in the evening at about 8 p.m. before she came down for meditation. But many a day they had to wait for hours, even up to 10 p.m. They would feel hungry or sleepy and had to go without their dinner, for the meditation followed immediately after their meeting. One day one of them lost patience and went away, leaving her flowers in a dish for the mother. Just then, the mother came. The girls were very much struck by this coincidence. What a test, they thought. As soon as one girl approached the mother asked, "Who has left this dish of flowers here?" "Oh, is it X? You really surprise me. You can't wait even a little while for me, you get so impatient. Do you know how the gods and goddesses yearn to have my darshan, and the saints and sages consider themselves most blessed when they see me in their meditation even for a minute?" "But, mother," replied the girl, "we look upon you as our friend. When we stand under the shelter of a tree, do we think of it giving us a cool shade?" That sweet answer disarmed the mother completely, and she immediately took her into her arms. We have seen her coming drenched in perspiration from her game of tennis and taking French translation classes soon after, or going to the sports ground to watch our tournaments, herself taking down the names and scores of each participant, her spiritual force acting simultaneously, protecting, sustaining and inspiring all, her very presence electrifying the atmosphere with a divine energy and quietude. She would hold one end of the tape at the terminus in the running competitions. She had even gone out to watch our team playing friendly matches with outside clubs. Twice she witnessed the Calcutta Mohan Bagan football team's display and was so impressed by it that she changed her opinion of the game. She had considered it a rough, vital play where one was bound to get some injury. In fact, that was what happened with our young players. But the spectacular display by the Calcutta team playing such a clean game made her remark, "I didn't know that football could be played in such a clean manner." All the players came for the mother's blessings and presented to her the new football they had won. Then returning from all these functions to the playground, she continued her daily round of interviews, watching the marching, taking classes or distributing sweets to all the ashramites, till about 9:00 p.m. This was her program throughout the year, one activity or another filled up every moment and, mind you, this continued till her 80th year. Where did she get all this energy from? Her body was frail, food and sleep were medically quite inadequate to cope with her superabundant vitality. "Do you think I live on these frugal meals alone? One can draw any amount of energy from universal nature," she once said. Here we are face to face with the divine energy, the Shakti incarnate. Like Sri Aurobindo with regard to his massive correspondence, she could say, "If for nothing else, at least for my interminable activity, I should be called an avatar." My aim in drawing this picture of the mother is not merely to demonstrate her dynamism. There have been quite a number of people in the world, Napoleon for example, who had a magnificent vital energy, but they are of a different category. Here all her actions are symbolic, they are the expressions of the divine force, Chit Shakti, she embodies, and that force she has given freely to the young ones as she had done to the older generation. It infiltrates everything that it comes in contact with, she leaves a part of her divine presence wherever she goes. She has said also she never forgets any person who has come in contact with her even for a moment. The person finds a place in her divine consciousness. Sri Aurobindo said to me that with each one of us here she has her emanation. I believe that would be in some sense true for all those who have come in contact with her, and it would help them through life's strenuous and perilous journey. I shall now finish this chapter with an account of my utter discomfiture in trying to argue with the mother over a subject about which I had very little knowledge. The mother was describing to Sri Aurobindo the physical features of the brothers of a particular family. At some point, I don't remember exactly when, I was foolish enough to contradict her. She replied, Better keep quiet. You know nothing. The episode was over and I had forgotten all about it. But the surprise of surprises, later on the mother called me out of Sri Aurobindo's room and putting her hand on my shoulder explained almost in an apologetic tone how I was wrong. I expressed my sincere regret for my interruption and said that I certainly did not mind her rebuke. I was indeed very much moved by her divine considerateness. If she would be rude or severe on occasions, she once said that Sri Aurobindo was a gentleman. She was not. We have seen her Mahakali aspect, freezing silence, ironical smile, cold look. Her Mahalakshmi graciousness too was showered upon us often. For example, she used to give me, on my birthdays, a pair of fine dhotis from the stock meant for Sri Aurobindo. However hard she might appear outside, and it was unfortunately for us very necessary, she is our true mother and her only concern is to lead us to the light. War and politics. India's independence. World War II, in which India also was involved, began in 1939, a year after Sri Aurobindo's accident, and ended in 1945 with the victory of the Allies. India's long struggle for liberty came to an end in 1947 when she became independent. This was one of the most exciting phases in our 12-year stay with Sri Aurobindo. We had the unique opportunity of watching with him, from his room and, following step by step, the long course and rapid development of these two historic events, on the one hand, the great danger to Europe and the whole world, on the other, opportunity given to India to gain her freedom by her cooperation with the Allies. We shared with Sri Aurobindo his hopes and fears, his anticipations, prognostications and prophecies. He allowed us some glimpses into his action and gave a calm assurance of the victory of the divine cause. For the mother had declared that it was her war. Hitler's star was in the ascendant for a time. His panzer divisions racing through France making Paris' fate hang in the balance, his Luftwaffe over London, Rommel's overrunning of North Africa, the Allied invasion of Europe, the Battle of Stalingrad, all these and many other episodes kept us in breathless suspense. But in the midst of all these dramatic upheavals, Sri Aurobindo never lost his calm equanimity, though he knew very well indeed what was at stake. He said that Hitler was the greatest menace the world had to face and that he would stop at nothing to achieve his sinister object, even destroy the whole civilization, for an idiot hour destroys what centuries made, as we find in a verse in Savitri. An account of what was said and done in Sri Aurobindo's room during this period will be revelatory in many respects. First of all, it will dispel the prevailing universal misconception that Sri Aurobindo was a world-shunning yogi immersed in his own sadhana. It will show, on the contrary, how much he was concerned with the good of humanity. Far from taking only a passive interest in the vast conflict, the modern Kurukshetra, where the fate of the entire world was being decided, he actively participated in it with his spiritual force and directed that very fate to a victorious consummation. The account will also bring to light Sri Aurobindo's acute political insight and wide knowledge of military affairs. Although he had left public life in 1910 and lived thereafter in seclusion for nearly half a century, he always kept in touch with all world movements through outer and inner means. Perhaps people will find it difficult to believe and many will flatly deny that such a spiritual force exists, and it will be hard for them to swallow that, if at all it exists, a man acquiring and possessing it can apply it to an individual or cosmic purpose. But fortunately we have Sri Aurobindo's own word for it and our personal experience in its support. In fact, his integral yoga aims at nothing less than bringing down the supramental consciousness and changing the present terrestrial consciousness by its dynamic power and light. We shall also witness Sri Aurobindo's vital interest in India's struggle for freedom, for which he had himself launched the first movement, awakening the country to her birthright and aiding her later by his decisive spiritual force towards its achievement. Though we in the Ashram are not supposed to take part in politics, we are not at all indifferent to world affairs. In fact, Sri Aurobindo has said that we are immensely interested in them. The journal Mother India, which was a semi-political fortnightly, and came out 2 years after India's independence, was edited by one of the Sardaks who was living in Bombay, and the editorials were sent to Sri Aurobindo for approval before publication. Sri Aurobindo gave many long and regular interviews to a political leader of Bengal and gave him advice and directions regarding the contemporary situation. The mother too has said that the supermind cannot but include in its ultimate work for world change the political administration, since all secular well-being rests in the hands of the governing power of the country. Besides, the war was not a simple political issue among the big nations. The Nazi aggression meant the peril of black servitude and a revived barbarism threatening India and the world. It was a life-and-death question for the spiritual evolution of the new man, for the emergence of a new race which the mother and Sri Aurobindo had come to initiate and establish on the earth. And the victory of Hitler's Germany would mean not only the end of civilization, but also the death of that great possibility. It is in this sense I have called this war a modern Kurukshetra. Let us then go back to the crucial year 1938, when dark war clouds were gathering and rumblings were heard all over Europe. There was a strong possibility that fighting would break out in December, just a week or two after the night of November the 23rd, when Sri Aurobindo had his accident. But, as he indicated in our talks, his force pushed it back to a later date, for war at that time would have been a great hindrance to his work. It is possible to surmise that the irresistible forces which no human power could check turned their fury on one who had checked them. Long before Hitler's actual invasion of Poland, long before any other person, Sri Aurobindo had seen this dark Asuric power rising in Germany and striding over Europe, making Hitler its demoniac instrument, a pseudo-colossus, a self-acclaimed Napoleon. Therefore he supported the Allies and warned India of the forthcoming peril, much to the chagrin and indignation of our blind countrymen. Future events proved his forecast right to the letter. We used to have discussions on the international political situation from the very start. Hitler's insane lust for power, England's political bankruptcy, America's suicidal policy of non-intervention, Russia's shrewd Machiavellian diplomacy, all were subjects of the verbal to and fro in Sri Aurobindo's room. Chamberlain's ill-famed peace mission, Colonel Beck's militant interview with Hitler, France's betrayal of Czechoslovakia evoked vigorous protests or praises from us. Sri Aurobindo observed how one nation after another was hypnotized by Hitler's Asuric MA with Macron and submitted to his diabolical charm, how the intellectuals did not raise any voice against the Hitlerian menace. On seeing a photograph of Chamberlain and Hitler taken during their meeting at Munich, Sri Aurobindo said that Chamberlain looked like a fly before a spider, on the point of being caught, and he actually was caught. Of course, the German dictator had already put Mussolini in his pocket. Only Colonel Beck seemed to have kept some manly individuality. Many other issues Sri Aurobindo discussed with us, as will be evident from the book Talks with Sri Aurobindo, as though we were all keen-sighted statesmen and generals, and the talks were usually enlivened by Sri Aurobindo's genial humor. In these talks he imparted to us a clear vision of the issues at stake, but never imposed his views. When we dared to differ or failed to follow him, he patiently explained to us where we were wrong. His physical nearness made us realize, with an extraordinary lucidity, what terrible inhuman forces were trying to overcast the world with an small darkness from which a supreme divine power alone could save it. For all the war news we had to depend on the daily newspapers, since members of the ashram were not supposed to have radios. Somebody in the town began to supply us with short bulletins. When the war had taken a full-fledged turn, the radio news was transmitted to Sri Aurobindo's room so he might follow the war movements from hour to hour. Here we find a notable instance of the spiritual flexibility of his rules and principles. What had been laid down for a particular time and condition would not be inviolable under altered circumstances. Sri Aurobindo, who was once a mortal opponent of British rule in India, came to support the Allies against the threat of world domination by Hitler. Not merely a non-cooperator but an enemy of British imperialism, he now listened carefully to the health bulletins about Churchill when he had pneumonia, and, we believe, even helped him with his force to recover. It is the rigid mind that cries for consistency under all circumstances. I still remember Sri Aurobindo breaking the news of Hitler's march and England's declaration of war. For a time the world hung in suspense, wondering whether Hitler would flout Holland's neutrality and then penetrate into Belgium. We had very little doubt of his intention. It was evening. Sri Aurobindo was alone in his room. As soon as I entered, he looked at me and said, "Hitler has invaded Holland." Well, we shall see. That was all. 2 or 3 such laconic but pregnant remarks regarding the war still ring in my ears. At another crucial period, when Stalin held a threatening pistol at England and was almost joining hands with Hitler, we were dismayed and felt that there would be no chance for the divine, was such a formidable alliance to take place. Sri Aurobindo at once retorted, "Is the divine going to be cowed by Stalin?" When, seeing Hitler sweeping like a meteor over Europe, a Sardak cried in despair to the Guru, "Where is the divine? Where is your word of hope?" Sri Aurobindo replied calmly, "Hitler is not immortal." Then the famous Battle of Dunkirk and the perilous retreat, the whole Allied army exposed to enemy attack from land and air, and the bright summer sun shining above. All of a sudden a fog gathered from nowhere and gave unexpected protection to the retreating army. We said, "It seems the fog helped the evacuation." To which Sri Aurobindo remarked, "Yes, the fog is rather unusual at this time." We, of course, understood what he meant. It was after the fall of Dunkirk and the capitulation of France that Sri Aurobindo began to apply his force more vigorously in favor of the Allies, and he had the satisfaction of seeing the rush of German victory almost immediately arrested and the tide of war begin to turn in the opposite direction. Thus, we see, Sri Aurobindo was not simply a passive witness, a mere verbal critic of the Allied war policy. When India was asked to participate in the war effort, and the mother and Sri Aurobindo, much to the surprised indignation of our countrymen, contributed to the war fund, he, for the first time, made clear to the nation what issues were involved in the war. I remember the mother darting into Sri Aurobindo's room quite early in the morning with a sheet of paper in her hand. I guessed that something private was going to be discussed and discreetly withdrew. Then Purani came most unexpectedly. "Ah! Here is something afoot," I said to myself. A couple of days later the secret was revealed in all the newspapers. Sri Aurobindo had made a donation to the war fund. Of course, he explained why he had done so. He stated that the war was being waged in defense of civilization and its highest attained social, cultural and spiritual values and the whole future of humanity. Giving the lead, he acted as an example for others to follow. But, all over the country, protests, calumnies and insinuations were his lot. Even his disciples were nonplussed in spite of his explanation why he had made that singular gesture. A disciple wrote to the mother, "The Congress is asking us not to contribute to the war fund. What shall we do?" The answer given was, "Sri Aurobindo has contributed for a divine cause. If you help, you will be helping yourselves." Some were wishing for the victory of the Nazis because of their hatred for the British. The mother had to give a stern admonition. She wrote, "It has become necessary to state emphatically and clearly that all who by their thoughts and wishes are supporting and calling for the victory of the Nazis are by that very fact collaborating with the Ashura against the divine and helping to bring about the victory of the Ashura." Here I may quote a fellow Sardak's report on the mother's pro-Allies attitude. P reported to the mother my reactions to Sri Aurobindo's recent contribution to the war fund. I did not know about it. Suddenly I saw the mother quite unmindful of me. I thought it might be because she was very busy in those days. But I observed her for 3 days, and was convinced that something was amiss. I approached her and asked, "Why are you ignoring me?" She said, "You know it very well." But I was puzzled. I guessed every other reason than the true one, which according to her was serious. I did not think that P would report to her my talks with him. So I begged her to tell me what I had done, because I was sure to rectify my grave error. To this she said, with severity, there are things that were settled long before you were even born. We have been working on them for a long time. Now you with your infinitesimally small mind believe that all that is nothing, that Sri Aurobindo and I are wrong, and that you are right in your judgment. I was taken aback. It flashed before me, what could be the reason? Being nonplussed, I expressed my surprise. Is it something about the war that I spoke to P? The mother made the sign of yes. I felt relieved and said, oh, it was nothing. I just spoke to him casually, it was not at all serious. But the mother's face was stern and she said, not serious. It was almost unbelievable that you of all persons could speak like that about Sri Aurobindo. Haven't you read all that he has given out to the press? I said, yes, mother, I have. But have not the British done anything wrong to India? The mother replied, we never said that they had not, nor do we say that in the future they will not do so any more. But today the question is not that, don't you understand it? When you see your neighbor's house on fire, and yet you do not go to help to put it out because he has done wrong to you, you risk the burning of your own house and the loss of your own life. Do you not see the difference between the forces that are fighting for the divine and those for the asuras? I said, yes, mother, I do see. Only what baffles me is that Churchill, whom you and Sri Aurobindo have chosen as your direct instrument, wants today India's help for his own country's existence, and yet says that His Majesty's government has no intention of liquidating its empire. The mother said, but leave all that to the divine. Churchill is a human being. He is not a yogi aspiring to transform his nature. Today he represents the soul of the nation that is fighting against the asuras. He is being guided by the divine directly and his soul is responding magnificently. All concentration must be now to help the Allies for the victory that is ultimately assured, but there must be no looseness, not the slightest opening to the asuras. After the battle is won, if Churchill's soul can remain still in front and he continues to be guided by the divine, he will go very fast in the line of evolution. But generally on Earth it doesn't happen like that. His human mind and vital will take the lead after the crisis is over, and then he will come down to the level of the ordinary human being, though of a higher order. When Dr. Rio, one of the consultant physicians attending on Sri Aurobindo, said that a lot of people in Madras were wondering how Sri Aurobindo, who had been so anti-British, could contribute to the war fund, the master explained to him at great length why he had taken that step. His intention was that Dr. Rio should speak about it to others when the occasion arose. Among the points already known, Sri Aurobindo disclosed his own occult action in the war. He said, do you know that Hitler is trying to get a foothold in South America and doing extensive propaganda there? It can lead to an attack against the USA. He is now practically master of Europe. If he had invaded England after the collapse of France, he could have been in Asia by this time. Now another force has been set up against his. Still the danger has not passed. He has a 50% chance of success. Up to the time when France collapsed, he was remarkably successful because he had behind him an Asuric power which guided him. From that power he received remarkably correct messages. The trouble about India is that the British have not kept a single promise so far. Nobody trusts them. Sri Aurobindo, the fact is they don't believe that India will help them if she is given dominion status. Otherwise they would have given it. I don't think India will refuse to help. Sri Aurobindo, don't you? What about the left wing, the communists, Bose, for instance? And it is not true that they have given nothing. It is the character of the British to go by stages. Whenever their self-interest is at stake they come to a compromise. They gave provincial autonomy and didn't exercise any veto power. It is the Congress which spoiled everything by resigning. If without resigning it had put pressure on the centre, it would have got by now what it had wanted. It is for two reasons that I support the British, for India's own interest and for humanity, and the reasons I have given are external ones, there are spiritual reasons too. Sri Aurobindo was not only fighting Hitler, he had also the onerous task of conquering the extreme antipathy of his own disciples towards the British. The ashram ran the danger of being disbanded for our anti-British and pro-Hitler feelings. How many letters had Sri Aurobindo to write to his disciples to show their grave error and the danger of the Nazi victory? I quote only one such letter he wrote to a disciple, in 1942, "You should not think of it as a fight for certain nations against others or even for India. It is a struggle for an ideal that has to establish itself on earth in the life of humanity, for a truth that has yet to realize itself fully and against a darkness and falsehood that are trying to overwhelm the earth and mankind in the immediate future. It is the forces behind the battle that have to be seen and not this or that superficial circumstance. There cannot be the slightest doubt that if one wins, there will be an end of all such freedom and hope of light and truth, and the work that has to be done will be subjected to conditions which would make it humanly impossible. There will be a reign of falsehood and darkness, a cruel oppression and degradation for most of the human race such as people in this country do not dream of and cannot yet at all realize. If the other side that has declared itself for the free future of humanity triumphs, this terrible danger will have been averted and conditions will have been created in which there will be a chance for the ideal to grow, for the divine work to be done, for the spiritual truth for which we stand to establish itself on the earth. Those who fight for this cause are fighting for the divine and against the threatened reign of the Asura." In a talk in 1940, Sri Aurobindo said, "There are forces which are trying to destroy the British and their empire, forces above and here in this world, I mean inner forces. I myself had wished for its destruction, but at that time I did not know such forces would arise. These forces are working for the evolution of a new world order which would come following upon the liquidation of the empire. But, for the advent of this new arrangement, the empire needn't be destroyed. The new arrangement can be achieved more quietly by a change in the balance of forces, without much destruction. Had it not been for Hitler, I wouldn't have cared what power remained or went down. Now the question is whether the new world order is to come after much suffering and destruction or with as little of it as possible. Destruction of England would mean victory for Hitler, and in that case, perhaps after a great deal of suffering and oppression, and reaction to them, that world order may come or may not, or it may come only after Pralaya. Of course the issue has been decided by the divine vision and there can be no change. But nobody knows what the decision is. These two long extracts are enough to show clearly Sri Aurobindo's vision of the play of forces, how they try through the use of human instruments to fulfill their purpose, and also what Sri Aurobindo's part was in this mysterious play. I shall now give some extracts from our talks to demonstrate Sri Aurobindo's close watch on the trend of the war, his comments on the military movements of the contending parties, sometimes his anticipation of their strategic moves and the consequences that would ensue, or his own suggestions about the courses that could be followed. And all this came enlivened with a sense of quiet humor that made the grimness of the war itself appear light, even an enjoyable game of forces. On the 29th of December 1940, Savarkar gave a speech in which he said that the British could not be defeated. Sri Aurobindo commented, "Nonsense. They were saved by divine intervention. They would have been smashed if Hitler had invaded England at the right time after the fall of France.